How you guys doing? I'm going to try to explain imperialism in World War One to you in a quick way. This is going to be stuff that's going to be solely based on your test that I'm going to administer to you through Google Classroom coming up this week. You have a lot of work with this that was sent home with the packet that many of you have handed in, so good job with that. So, like I said, I'm going to do my best to try to make this quick but thorough for those of you who like the in-class instruction. First step is, what is imperialism? Most of you have background knowledge of this from global studies. You see the definition here. It says a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Long story short is that once countries feel that they are strong enough and they have the need, they need to go outside of their borders for things that we'll get to with the next bullet there. Really, the big thing is going to be raw materials and markets. You need more resources, you need more stuff. It's all about dollars and cents in the economy. Better technology leads to better transportation, and you can get to other areas of the world much quicker. Also, for our military purposes, it's good to have military bases established around the world. Some early areas that were of our influence were China, Japan, Hawaii, and Samoa. You see the big two policies there for China are open door policy and the Boxer Rebellion. Rather than spend time on that for U.S. history purposes, just know that sometimes some countries don't want us in their influencing them. Just think about somebody setting up a tent in your backyard, and you're looking out and you're wondering what they're doing there. They're invading your privacy, they're invading your territory, and you don't want them there. So naturally, not everyone's going to be so welcome to the United States coming over. And that's really what you see there with the Boxer Rebellion. That was an example of an uprising against some foreign influence. It's going to fail. It's not going to be successful. Japan, Commodore Matthew Perry, he's really going to be responsible for modernizing Japan. He does it in an aggressive way. He goes there with military gunships and says, I'll be back in a year. And if you don't open up your ports to trade, we're going to use these guns against you. So Japan was sort of forced to modernize, and you may recollect from prior knowledge that's called the Meiji Restoration. And that's going to lead to some problems for the United States down the road, and we'll talk about that. Not with this PowerPoint, but somewhere down the road, really, when we talk about World War II. Hawaii becomes part of the United States after the Spanish-American War. We have some influence in there a little bit earlier, but in 1898 officially becomes part of the United States. Later on, it becomes obviously the last state of the United States, and American Samoa, which it is now known as, but you see here on the map where Hawaii and Samoa are located out there in the Pacific. So think about the game of chess and the United States just trying to establish itself around the globe and having these strategic places for military purposes and, of course, for trading. Um, One of the first big conflicts that we have during the late 1800s that can be correlated to imperialism is the Spanish-American War. At this time, the United States is becoming a world power. It is not the top dog, but it's getting close. Um, our issue with Spain is going to be long-standing, and we're going to have our immediate causes as well. You see here the economic, humanitarian, and expansionist. Like most things with imperialism, there's always an underlying reason as to why the United States sometimes gets involved in these conflicts, and this conflict especially gave us the opportunity to gain some areas. You see the humanitarian issues there with Cuba, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But really, what we're interested in for the Spanish-American War is going to be the immediate causes. These big three you will see on every Regents in some shape or form. Really, yellow journalism and the USS Maine. If I was going to rank them in the way that you would see them on the Regents, it would be yellow journalism first, sinking of the USS Maine second, and the DeLome letter, which is going to be third. Yellow journalism is something that you probably are used to today with a lot of headlines and a lot of grab your attention kind of deals. But you see the definition here. It says papers printed the sensational stories. They posted pictures that made people really catch their eye. And the two big yellow journalists during this time period were William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. You see, I have them in bold there. It's important for you to recognize these names and know that they're synonymous with yellow journalism. That's going to be one cause. Yellow journalism really gathered the United States public's interest, and it really supported the public for this conflict with Spain. The Delome letter is basically like your, good old-fashioned Twitter trash talking, but for 1898 purposes. The Spanish leader Enrique Diplo de Lome wrote a letter calling President McKinley weak in catering to the rabble. He basically was challenging the president at that time, saying that he wasn't going to really do much about what was going on. Therefore, the United States didn't want to back down from that threat. But the big and the immediate cause for the Spanish-American War and why we got involved is the sinking of the USS Maine. Anytime you see the USS, it's going to be a ship. In this sense, in this case, I should say, it was a ship that was outside the coast of Cuba, which was controlled by Spain at the time. And ironically enough, the ship exploded. So a lot of people in the United States thought there was some fishy business going on and that the Spanish had something to do with it. 266 Americans died. The public blamed Spain, but later on it was found out that Spain really had nothing to do with it. The next slide you can see is going to be an example of yellow journalism. You see this big, bold headline, "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy," really grabbing the attention for the American public. And naturally, if you're reading this at this time period, you're going to get angry, you're going to get mad, and you're going to want revenge. So the decision to go to war really was an easy one at this point. The results from it were regained areas, and that's what imperialism is all about. We got the Philippines for 20 million bucks. You see there with the second bullet. We also got Puerto Rico and Guam, which are still parts of the United States today. And many of you probably have been to Puerto Rico before, maybe of Puerto Rican descent. The Platt Amendment, you see, says grants Cuba its independence for a short time. We'll talk about Cuba, obviously, when we get to the Cold War period. Now they become a hot spot for the Cold War, and you're going to see a map in a second to see how close Cuba is to us. And also one of the biggest things that comes into light in this situation, we're gaining these areas, but how does the Constitution apply to these areas? Basically, long story short, Congress gets to decide where the constitutional rights extend to. So these places who are seemingly taken over by the United States have to fall within the line of what Congress says for them. Some win, some lose. You see here, that's the southern point. I'll try to go with my cursor here. That's the southern part of the United States, which is Florida. You see here, and that's the Keys. And this is Cuba. So this is 90 miles south of the coast of the United States. It's close. When we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is going to cause some major issues because of the nuclear threat of the USSR, but we won't get into that now. The next phase of imperialism is going to be Latin America. So you can see here, if you try to envision this, we're like moving around the world, like I referred to before, we're playing chess. This is going to bring Theodore Roosevelt into light in a different sense. If you remember with the Progressive Era, Theodore Roosevelt had a lot to do with domestic policy, which is going to be your Meat Inspection Act. He preserved the national parks. He was a conservationist, which saved millions of acres of land that we still have today. He was a trust buster. He broke up those monopolies, but he also was a big foreign policy guy. And the big thing he brings back to life is going to be that Monroe Doctrine, which you hopefully remember from a few months back. And you can see in the bottom there, it says, "Don't mess with the United States." Essentially, what was going on, there were some issues in the Dominican Republic and Venezuela, and Theodore Roosevelt brings back the Monroe Doctrine and says, listen, Europe, don't think about getting involved in these areas. We'll take care of it. We will act like a world police. We'll stay on our half of the hemisphere, and you can stay on yours. After Roosevelt leaves, I'm sorry, that's the next slide. One of the most famous foreign policies of Theodore Roosevelt is the big stick policy. And we're going to see a political cartoon of what that exactly means in a moment. But you have to remember, this is all foreign policy. Some of us get jammed up with this, and we get confused, or we can't look at something and decide, oh, is that foreign or is that domestic? Anything dealing with an outside country is foreign. He's famously quoted as saying, speak softly, but carry a big stick, meaning use your words, try to be diplomatic, which means talk it out. And if not, we'll use our weapons, we'll use our guns, we'll use whatever we have, the military might that we have to get our point across. But let's be cordial and let's try to solve our issues uh, diplomatically first. And that's basically what you see with that second bullet there. And this is a very famous political cartoon, and there's a lot of things to take note of here. You can pause the video if you want and take a look at it. But you see Theodore Roosevelt again. You know, these political cartoonists, when we did this project in class, they portray their main subject sometimes as larger than life, and that's what they do here with Theodore Roosevelt. He's standing there in the United States. He's standing in between Europe, and he's standing in between Latin America, and he has that big stick that says "New Diplomacy," and he's basically acting as a world police. And you see the Capitol building in the background there. So this is just a way to portray that foreign policy of Theodore Roosevelt's. After Roosevelt leaves office, he hands the torch over to William Howard Taft. You guys may know the fun trivia fact of him that he was so large and in charge that he got stuck in his bathtub and he had to get helped out. So he was a rather portly man. He did lose about 100 pounds afterwards, though, for those of you who are interested in those little trivia facts. He has a foreign policy with Latin America, and it's called dollar diplomacy. It's almost the same as the big stick policy, but this is in regards to investments. Again, remember what I referred to before. Sometimes some countries don't want us involved where they live. Same thing with dollar diplomacy. You may not want American businesses coming into your territory, but sort of we have that military might, and this is what this political cartoon is showing. You see President Taft's dollar diplomacy. On the mantle there is Teddy's big stick, referring to the big stick policy, and they're basically saying he's saying there at the bottom, go invest in Latin America with the full faith of the U.S. government. Oh, and its military. Basically saying that, if they're not going to listen to us, we'll make them listen to us with our military. And you can see all the corporations over there: U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, AT&T, which is still around today. Just these big investment corporations that will go start making their influence around the world. One of the other and huge areas for this was actually during the Roosevelt administration. It started the building and it's completed afterwards, but the Panama Canal. And we'll take a picture of what this looks like. We'll see a picture of what it looks like in a moment. But the Panama Canal, when you want to trade, time is everything. Think about getting an Amazon delivery. I know times have changed considerably, and we are waiting for our packages. Some of us are having trouble getting our groceries, and it seems like the end of the world. It's really tough for us right now if we don't want to leave our house. But think about how it was before this whole pandemic began. You can order something on Amazon, and it magically shows up at your house within the next day, hours even, depending on where the facility is that the item that you ordered is shipping from. When you can ship faster, you can charge less, you can make more money because you can sell more. Theodore Roosevelt sees this prime spot in Panama, which is part of Colombia, but the problem is Colombia doesn't want us building it there. So what do? We basically influence Panama to have its own revolution and overthrow Colombia. Once they do that, the people of Panama allow us to build what is known as the Panama Canal. And this literally cuts trade because we do not have to ship our goods around South America. We can actually go through the middle part of the continent. It's called an isthmus, and you can build, and it was a man-made canal. You can see it here. It literally goes through these series of canals, and you can trade. You can see where it is right there on the top right part of the screen, and it will just allow us to ship our goods so much faster around the world. And when you can do that, the money starts coming in a lot quicker. Forgive me for stuttering and not maybe being as fluent as I would like to be. It's kind of late at night, and this is my first time doing this, so just bear with me. We're almost there. Moving on to World War One, and this is the second half of what we're focusing on here, and what the second half of your test is going to be on. The background here is you, again, last year have learned this. You learned it from the European perspective. We're not going to talk about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. We're not going to get into all that stuff. What we're going to really look at is the U.S. involvement and how it affected the United States. But the background, again, remember, we do not enter the war at the beginning. The war began in 1914. We enter in 1917. Just the reasons why it broke out: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. The acronym MAIN. I won't get into what that means, but because again, for our purposes of our test and our course, and what's going on now, we just don't have time to explain that, and you already learned it. But it's good to know the alliances, the big, the good guys and the bad guys, if you will. You have the Triple Alliance, which is quote unquote the bad guys, which are Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente, which is France, Russia, and Britain. Taking a look at a map here, this is what Europe looked like at the time of World War One with those alliances. You have the Triple Entente, which is basically like your satellite nations. They're surrounding the nucleus there, which is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. So the red are the Triple Alliance, and the blue are the Triple Entente. Eventually, the United States will enter, obviously, and they will enter on the side of Great Britain, France, and Russia. Italy will jump ship at some point in this war, and they will join the side of the Triple Entente. Why do we enter? It's always going to be the long-term causes and your immediate causes. That's any sort of conflict, even with a friend. You get in a fight with, there's probably long-standing issues with that friend. It's not something that happens immediately. So the United States has a lot of cultural links to the people who were involved in this war. Remember, Britain was a long ally of ours. We defeated them in the American Revolution. We have to remember now, that's long in the past. They're one of our number one trading partners in the world, and if they hurt, we hurt. So we have cultural links to these places. Economic ties, like I just said. We basically start showing favoritism to the Triple Entente before we even get involved in this war. And the Triple Alliance and people like Germany and countries like that, they're going to notice. Even though the United States says we're not getting involved, we're neutral, we're neutral, we're neutral, we can show that we're not neutral by who we support economically. And we're not supporting the Germanys and the Italys of the world at this time. We're supporting the French and the British and people like that. So Germany's noticing that, and they're starting to hold a grudge. Also, propaganda. That's still around today in many aspects, but people at home here in the United States perceived, through yellow journalism, if you want to call it that, perceived this war as a war against a barbaric Germany, and a civilized rest of the world. So the people at home looked at Germany as barbaric. This is where we get into the immediate causes, these last two bullets, the German unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman Note. These are on the regions a lot, especially German unrestricted submarine warfare. Do not get confused of this ship sinking, the Lusitania. Don't get that confused with the Maine. The USS Maine, which I referred to earlier, was a cause of the Spanish-American War. The sinking of the Lusitania is a cause of World War One. What happens here is that this ship was headed toward, I believe it was Britain, somewhere in Britain, and it was carrying some Americans. You can see 128 Americans lose their lives, and 1,200 people total lose their lives. At first, people think this was the Germans just opening fire, with their U-boats, which is a submarine, on a harmless ship that was just carrying passengers. The Lusitania was not a military ship. It was like a cruise liner. It's like if you're going on a Royal Caribbean cruise or something like that. But the Germans had suspected that there was potential ammunitions on that ship. Later on, they were right. They found out that it proved to be that there was ammunitions that could be used against them in war. they did warn people sailing in that area of the world that they would fire upon them, and still the Lusitania sailed through those waters. So, yes, it was a tragic loss of those lives, but I guess as time has gone on, you can say both sides had to, had some fault to this. Again, 1,200 people losing their lives is tragic, and especially those 128 Americans. So that's German unrestricted submarine warfare. The Zimmerman note was what I call probably the last straw. It was a telegram, almost like a text message, that was intercepted by the United States, and it's essentially Germany calling for Mexico to get involved in the war. They basically say to Mexico, hey, join the war, help us fight, and when we win, we'll give you back the lost territory in the southern, uh, southwestern part of the United States. And I think I have the Zimmerman telegram or a copy of it uh, in a second to show you. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. This is the New York Times headline for when the Lusitania was unfortunately struck. You see here, Lusitania sunk by a submarine, probably 1,260 dead, twice torpedoed off the Irish coast, sinks in 15 minutes. You can read the rest of the headline yourself if you want. There it is. That's the Zimmerman telegram. You see the areas that they're promising back to Mexico if they join the war and Germany wins. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, places like that. So naturally, if you're the United States and you're seeing this, you are going to get kind of ticked off and realize that they're forcing your hand. They're forcing you to try to get involved, and that's what we do. Just wars today are different than the wars back then, but you can draw a lot of comparisons to what's going on with this pandemic, or at least some. The president of the United States, President Trump, enacted um, the Military Production Act, which allows the United States to direct companies to produce things that the United States needs. Um, our government hasn't been using it to its full capacity, but they're still using it to produce these ventilators that these patients need so badly, masks, things like that, the PPEs as they call them, for the doctors and the nurses and everybody else who's working so hard to keep us safe. That's what happens in World War One. That's what happens in World War Two. The government gets involved in the economy. They tell these certain businesses to start producing things that they need. For example, General Electric is producing ventilators for patients. General Electric doesn't make ventilators, but now they are because the government is telling them to do so. Supervised public utilities like telephones and telegraphs, and you see 16% of male workers enter the military with their jobs being filled by men and women. World War One is sort of like a dress rehearsal for World War Two. All the stuff is going to be on such a bigger and grander scale when World War Two occurs, and we'll get to that down the road probably in another week or two. Woodrow Wilson is the president at this time. If you remember, I know we went through it quickly, but the Progressive era, he was the last of the progressive presidents. He was a Democrat, and he did a lot of progressive measures at home. But he's also going to have foreign policy, and he's really remembered for his foreign policy more than anything else. He calls this war the war to end all wars. He says it's the war to make the world safe for democracy. It's the first American conflict outside the Western Hemisphere. It really was a game changer for the United States. We try to stay neutral. We say we're going to stay neutral. We get dragged into this war. We try to go back to being neutral, and it just doesn't work. You get to a point where you become so strong that you can't hide, and the world is going to look at you to try to solve some problems. Wilson's famous for his 14 points. These are not all of them. You'll see them in a moment. But he really says the way we can make peace after this war is by opening diplomacy, letting people talk to each other, trading on the seas with nobody firing upon each other, no trade barriers, people can trade, and creating an association of nations, which is going to be called the League of Nations. And we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. He also becomes notable because he's the first president to actually leave American soil during his presidency. I know that sounds odd because we're so used to the president of the United States flying around all the world and meeting with different foreign leaders, But that really wasn't something that presidents did at that time. So foreign travel was really new to the presidency at this time. The Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ends World War One. Once the United States gets involved, the war is basically going to be over soon, shortly thereafter. Germany is going to get all of the blame, and a lot of people look back at this and say that some of the punishment to Germany may have been too harsh, and maybe that was the reason why World War II occurs, and we can talk about that down the road. But for this purpose, the provisions or the guidelines or the criteria of the Treaty of Versailles was the following: Germany had to accept responsibility for the war. They had to pay huge reparations to the Allies. Reparations are like "I'm sorry" payments, like "Oops, sorry, my bad for causing this war. Here's a bunch of money." I think Germany actually just got done paying these payments a few years ago. I think maybe like 2015, 2016. My memory is not serving me correctly right now. You guys can Google it and look it up. But Germany just got done paying that kind of recently. They had to give up its military, so they couldn't protect themselves at all. They had to give up lands to new nations of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Ironically enough, guess which are the two nations that Hitler will invade once he comes to power in Germany down the road? Czechoslovakia and Poland. So you see, he tries to gain back the lands that he feels were stolen from him. They had to give up all their overseas territories. Uh, President Wilson sort of knew that these provisions were a little too harsh, but he really, really, really wanted this thing called the League of Nations. So he let this stuff be pushed aside because he felt that once the League of Nations was established, they can go back in and sort of edit this, like, come up with a new draft of the Treaty of Versailles. He just wanted to get the whole thing settled. What he didn't take into consideration was that the United States itself, the Congress, the Senate, more specifically, wouldn't sign the Treaty of Versailles. The United States never gets involved in this. So Woodrow Wilson travels across, he does all this negotiations, he gets this League of Nations, he works at it, but we know that we have checks and balances and we have a constitution. And the president is not just the only part of government that works. We'll get to that in one moment. This is the meeting of the Treaty of Versailles. You see how crowded this room is in the Hall of Mirrors in France. You can definitely look at this, pause the screen, just take a look in depth at Wilson's 14 points and the Treaty of Versailles. There are major provisions there that you see. But again, the long and short of it, of this, is that Germany got the brunt of the blame, and they really had to. They're going to go into a big depression economically after this. It's going to be a rough go of it, and that's going to open the door for someone like Hitler to be able to rise to prominence. We'll talk more about Hitler and why he's able to get to the point that he gets to when we get to World War II. The League of Nations and the American response. The U.S. Senate has to approve treaties. We know that. Hopefully you remember that from when we learned the Constitution. Republicans and Democrats. We have the battle today between Republicans and Democrats, and we had the battles back then. Republicans were pretty mad. They were mad that they weren't invited to go to the Treaty of Versailles, the meeting. Nobody asked them if they wanted to go. There was no Republican voice in the negotiations. Therefore, when it came time for the Senate to vote on the Treaty of Versailles, they rejected. Remember, you need a two-thirds vote for a presidential treaty, unless that treaty is not recognized. And that's exactly what happens. The main reason as to why we do not sign the Treaty of Versailles, therefore do not join the League of Nations, is because we did not want to get involved. A lot of Americans and a lot of politicians felt that this was a one-time deal, that you could join the war, do what you have to do, help Europe win, get Britain and France and Russia out of that mess, and then go back to being neutral. That's what Americans felt was the best move at the time, and that is why we did not join the League of Nations and sign the Treaty of Versailles. Here's another political cartoon portraying that, okay? And you can see Uncle Sam there standing there in the United States and being pulled every which way. And this echoed the sentiments of the American public at the time. They did not want to get pulled in every direction, being handcuffed and being controlled. And that's why we don't join, like I just said. War will always bring up constitutional issues, and we have to understand that during times of war, we have basically limited constitutional rights. That happened with the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which we learned about. Probably don't remember, but we learned about that. And these are the big three constitutional issues that were presented at the time of World War, shortly thereafter. The first one was Schenck versus the United States, and this is known as the clear and present danger case. We've mentioned this before in class. This is like shouting fire in a crowded movie theater. You can't just cite free speech if you do that. You can't go into a crowded movie theater, shout fire, cause chaos, and lead people to trampling upon each other and hurting each other, and even more so, causing death. Um, so basically, what this means is that your freedom of speech is limited. You cannot just use, say things and think it's just freedom of speech, especially if you're causing a danger to society. If you're putting people in danger with the words that you use, then you do not have freedom of speech. One of the biggest aspects that arises after World War One is the Red Scare. Like I said to you before, everything that happens in World War One, it's like a dress rehearsal for World War Two, because this stuff is going to just be magnified during that time period. But the Red Scare, think red, communist. Communists were known as Reds. After the war is over, Russia turns to the path of communism. And that's a whole story that we'll get into down the road. Communism is hostile to American values. It's kind of opposite of the American values, such as capitalism and private ownership, things along those lines. So Americans fear that we need to sort of look internally if we have any of these communists within our nation, and we take drastic measures. The Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts are two of those measures that were taken. You can reflect back and you can think that maybe they were too drastic. The Espionage Act made it a crime to interfere with the draft. The draft was used in World War One. The draft was used in World War Two. The draft was used in a few wars afterwards. We'll talk about, of course, Vietnam being one of the biggest pivotal drafts that led to a constitutional action of lowering the voting age. That's the 26th Amendment. Sedition Act made it a crime to speak or publish anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government, constitution, flag, or military services. You see this political cartoon here. This political cartoon is showing, again, a reaction to these sedition acts and the Espionage Act. You see Uncle Sam there with the sledgehammer. You see the fly on his forehead with the arrow pointed at it, and it says Reds, basically showing that's the communist threat, is a small little fly. I don't know about you, but if you had a fly on your forehead, you would not try to take a sledgehammer to hit the fly. You'd probably shoot away, and maybe it would fly away and not come back. So you see on the sledgehammer, it says too drastic sedition legislation, referring to the fact that it maybe was just a little bit too much. At the bottom, the caption reads, swat the fly, but use common sense. And that's on the right there, you see Oliver Wendell Holmes. That's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time. He's the Chief Justice that oversaw that Schenck versus the United States case, which was that clear and present danger case. So that's about it. That's the stuff that's going to be on your exam. I'm only going to post this video. I'm not going to put this slideshow up. So when I give you the review sheet to work on, you can use this video to help guide your answers, but I will not make this PowerPoint accessible just yet. So hopefully you guys watch this and you could bear, and you can stand listening to me for a half hour or so. But again, I tried to do the best I could to sum up about, 2 weeks worth of stuff into about a half hour. So miss you guys. If you like this, I'll try to do this again soon. And if you don't like it, I won't do it again. But I'll talk to you guys, and stay safe out there.